Today in our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, we're finally getting to the final church that is having a message sent to them from the Lord in the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and chapter 3. And we're coming to the church of Laodicea. This is the final church, and this is quite a mess of a church in a number of ways that we will look at together. It's a church that seems to think it's very powerful and wonderful, and the Lord has a very different description of this church. It's kind of a scary thing to consider how differently we might see ourselves from how the Lord himself sees us. So this church serves as a warning. It's the only church really that has absolutely no commendation. The Lord doesn't say anything positive about this church whatsoever. So let's start out and take a look here. To the angel of the church in Laodicea write. Laodicea had shown up earlier in the New Testament. In the book of Colossians, we find that this church apparently was a co-recipient of the epistle to the Colossians. Some believe they also were perhaps a co-recipient of the book to the Ephesians as well. So they have shown up before. He says, the Amen, the faithful and the true witness, the beginning of creation of God, says this. So Jesus describes himself here as the Amen. He has the final word. There's no argument with Jesus. He is the final word. He's the faithful and the true witness. So whatever he says is true. And at the beginning of creation, so he's in charge of all things. He's a creator and the sustainer of all things. And he says to this church, I know your deeds. Now, he said the exact same thing to the church of Philadelphia. I know your deeds. But with the church of Philadelphia, he goes on to commend them for their perseverance, among other things, and they're holding fast to his truth and holding fast to him. But to the church of Laodicea, it's a very different thing, and it's a warning shot for us. He says, I know your deeds, that you're neither cold nor hot, and I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spit you out of my mouth. These words have caused a lot of different opinions about exactly what he's talking about here. And so two options is that the Lord wants us either on fire for him, just really living to the highest extent for him, or he wants us to be totally cold and showing our lack of love for him by really just going through the motions. That's one option. I reject that option. I don't think the Lord ever wants us to be cold. I don't think the Lord ever wants us or ever tells us that it's all right not to be walking and living for him. We know in the New Testament a number of the churches struggled with various difficulties and sins and doctrinal issues and so forth. But the Lord never says that's okay. You just go ahead and live out your sinfulness. So I reject that. Here's what I think is going on. Geographically, we know that this church at Laodicea had some unique situations. They had in the mountains above them, or the hills above them, hot springs. And those hot springs were considered by the people at that time as being helpful for health issues as well as other purposes. And they piped down some of that hot water down into the city for their own purposes. Cold water, on the other hand, was available at locations near them, so they had available to them within very close proximity hot springs and cold water. Both have benefits. The hot springs they thought were medicinal and would help with their aches and pains, and maybe they did. The cold water, of course, was great for drinking and so forth. But the lukewarm water had very little value. So if they piped down the hot water from the springs to the city and let it sit around a while, it was just lukewarm. If they brought in cold water and let it sit around, it was lukewarm. Hardly anybody wants to drink or make much use of lukewarm water. It doesn't have any real value, and especially drinking it. And so he says here, if I take a drink of this lukewarm water, I'm going to spit it out. In my mind, my eyes, Jesus said, you are lukewarm before me. And so I think it means they were useless. They didn't have any real value as hot springs had or cold water had. They're useless to the Lord. And so he says, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. You have no purpose. You have no value for me. And so he says, you have no value to me as a church. What a sad thing to say to one of the 7 churches of Asia. You have no real value. As we'll see tomorrow, they thought they had a lot of value. Jesus had a very different commentary. We'll pick that up tomorrow.